Um, this was one of the this setup, this meeting is one of the things that I worked on with Danny Doucette. He's here in the room, and it's an honor to be invited to present here. Um, but yeah, so I'm here to talk to y'all a little bit about this theoretical, methodological, conceptual, analytical frameworks and all of the above, right? But what does it all really mean, and how can we use it in our research? Um, so again, that's my name. I work at the University of Utah as a postdoc, and I'll give a little rundown as to a little bit about my background, as well as some of what I did in my research, because it's going to be relevant, and I'll try to bring it up as an example as I talk about these things. So a little background. Acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge these people. So Jackie Cheney, my advisor back at UCF, Ramon Bartolome, my current postdoc advisor, Aaron Scanlon, who postdoc at UCF helped me a whole bunch, and Nidaikis Rodriguez, who also is a huge influential part of the work that I do. And of course, all the participants that have helped me out. I really appreciate them and everything they've contributed to. So a little bit about me. I'm Mexican and Puerto Rican. Mom's Puerto Rican, Mexican. My dad's Mexican. I'm born and raised in El Paso, Juarez. That's pretty much the borderline right here at the tip of Texas. And so growing up, it was just back and forth between El Paso and Juarez. So I learned to see different sides of life, different struggles when it comes to economic struggles, right? And a lot of different gender perspectives involved with cultural notions, as well as like sexuality and stuff like that. So there was a lot of things that were put into contrast when traveling these places, which informs a lot of what I do. I identify as a cis, straight Debbie man, which also I recognize in certain contexts has a lot of privilege. And so I try to recognize that privilege in order to deconstruct it and be strategic with it. And so that's a lot of my philosophy on that. I just graduated from UCF. I did my undergrad at the University of Texas at El Paso. And again, I'm currently a postdoc. I did some work with the National Society of Hispanic Physicists. Make sure to check them out. Worked with the APS Bridge program, National Mentoring Community. So I've been involved in the communities, and I was also a part of PERCoGS. I do have a personal desire, and my personal goal is to support students from marginalized communities so that they learn physics. I think we all should have this privilege of learning physics if we're willing to. So with all this, the next thing we start talking about theories and methods, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my research. So my dissertation was a qualitative study looking into the meaning of success in physics. So I guess I'll go back to me. So it was looking into this meaning of success in physics, and I did a lot of, I started from feminist standpoint theory as my guiding framework. As I worked with feminist standpoint theory, some of the things that I appreciated was the way that people from marginalized perspective with marginalized experiences tend to have a more well-rounded sense of things that can help out their situations. When it comes to the feminism, this specifically centered around supporting women. And then as I worked from that perspective, I recognized that I had to do interview works to uplift people's perspectives. And since I was working with words, right, I also personally have a lot of value for the linguistics and the words that we use and the power that they have. So to some extent, I ended up going into metaphor, conceptual metaphor theory as a way to understand the words that people are using. And eventually, some of the analysis that I was doing led me to do some poetic analysis because some of the metaphors, when I tried to interpret them, they just simply didn't have the emotional associations that the participants had intentionally like put on their words. And so to try to get back at that, I ended up doing a poetic analysis to focus on the emotions that the participant intended. And so at the end, we ended up finding a bunch of different metaphors of the meaning of success in physics. One of the prevalent metaphors was that of a journey. And so I worked with the participants to see what are the different aspects of a journey, as well as what are the things that the metaphors had in common, to see if there was some underlying structure to this journey. I ended up realizing that we had no Latinas. There was no Latina women in our sample. So I ended up refining the study to focusing more on those experiences. And since I was working with Latinas, I started also incorporating theories that centered the experiences of Latinas. So eventually, feminist standpoint theory kind of refined into critical race Nepantlera methodologies, which incorporates aspects of critical race theory. So like racism is ubiquitous in the United States. We have to work with we have to counter dominant narratives, and we had to do that through intersectional methods, through interdisciplinary methods as well. And then this also, the theory also incorporated Nepantlera theories. So Nepantleras are pretty much in-betweeners. Myself as a Mexican person, in academia, I have connections to a lot of resources, and right, so I mentioned a lot of these societies and stuff. And so these societies pretty much is how I ended up getting familiar with the structures. And so as I help out and interview people, I can be a bridge to get them connected to some of these resources. And then there was a feminist, Chicana feminist epistemologies, which highlights the cultural awareness and experiential awareness of researchers as Chicanas, right? And so myself, I'm not a Chicana, right? I'm a Chicano. But through my work, I've actually learned to deconstruct my own gender and really push the boundaries as to like, what does it mean to be a Chicano or a Chicana? And to what extent am I like able to use these theories? And so I do have a lot of pragmatic philosophies. So I try to incorporate ways and approaches that are going to help us answer questions, right? So that's a big rundown of what I did. And so as I go through this, I'm going to talk about those frameworks that these frameworks, right? Theoretical, methodologicals, and all that. And I'll use some of the examples that I had mentioned in my dissertation as I go about. Do y'all have any questions? I know I spoke a lot. All right, cool. So one of the things that I kind of want to set out from the start is this swing from theory to method, right? So I personally do research to try to generate knowledge that is relevant and specifically relevant with the sake of helping people's lives and making physics more accessible, right? So I have some already from the start, I have some ideas of what I want to do in my research. But as I do it, I want to be theoretically informed, right? So when it comes to theory, what does theory mean? I like this definition, right? So it's a set of interrelated constructs, definitions, and propositions that presents a systematic view of phenomena by specifying relations among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting phenomena, right? So it's pretty much these constructs and definitions, and then there's these relationships between the variables for the sake of explaining and predicting stuff, right? So as I go by it through the world, before I even knew the word theory, I was already building explanations and trying to explain what happened in the world, right? And so one of the beautiful things about physics is that it explained a lot of the physical phenomena that I didn't know how to describe, right? And to some extent, I don't know how to describe a lot of the phenomena beyond the physical phenomena. But as I go about life, who I talk to, my parents taught me, I have my own reasons why things happen, right? And we all have the reasons why things happen. And when we come into our research studies, we bring all those reasons. And as we become scholars, we start situating our work, not necessarily on exclusively on those theories, or those a priori implicit theories that we live with, but also start using the theories that other people have through their scholarship have developed. And then we start coming up with those capitalized letter theories that inform our world. And so as we use these explanations, we try to do research and we employ methods And two, I was not able to find a pretty definition for methods because it's a very general word, but it's pretty much the technical procedures followed by researchers for the purpose of collecting and analyzing data, right? And there's reasons why certain procedures are followed, right? And those reasons are connected to explanations, right? And so that's where this methodology comes in as the explanations and justifications of method for certain methods, right? And so we'll get more into that. But just wanted to bring it down. It's like there's these theories, there's these methods, and there's a lot of explanation that goes along. And these explanations are used to support our studies, right? So when I talk about a framework, now we're going to start talking about frameworks, right? What I think about, right, is this structure, right? It's funny because I looked up the word framework on Google and I just saw a whole bunch of like squares with arrows because like it's now used as this scholarly conceptual theoretical framework stuff. But it comes from constructing, right? From building and houses and stuff like that. And what a framework does is supports a building structure, right? Now, when it comes to doing our research, our studies are supported by theories, right? By reasons, by explanations. So that's where the frameworks that support our studies come in. We good there? Cool. Yeah, so there's these structures that support these multiple aspects of our studies. And so some of the ones that I'm going to go through are interpretive frameworks, which are very fundamental and often go unexamined. Then there's these more elaborate theoretical frameworks that to some extent overlap with the interpretive frameworks, and they also overlap with the methodological frameworks. But again, theoretical frameworks are the frameworks relating to the theories that explain the work. So there's going to be explanations from a whole bunch of different realms, right? And depending on the topic that we cover, we'll get into the different theories. Methodological frameworks relate to the specific methods that we employ, and again, the choice of methods. And depending on our interpretive and theoretical and all these different underlying frameworks, they kind of influence our data collection, the analytical frameworks, and so like the analytical procedures that we employ, but also like the validation and trustworthiness at the end of a study. So when it comes to the interpretive frameworks, there are these paradigms or beliefs that the researcher brings to the process of research, or that they may be theories or theoretical orientations that guide the practice of research. So Creswell and Poth describe these frameworks, including post-positivism, social constructivism, transformative postmodernism, pragmatism, some critical theories, but there's other interpretive frameworks, right? And so what are we interpreting? We're pretty much interpreting life, interpreting reality. And that's the, we use these frameworks to interpret, right? Now, these frameworks are concerned with ontologies. So like, what is being, what is reality? To some, reality is out there. To some, we construct reality as we go. Epistemology is like how we know what we know. So like, what is knowledge? Axiology has to do with like the values that individuals have, and especially researchers, and also methodology. So like what the things related to the process and choices of the research. All right. So for example, post-positivism, we kind of see it as relies on this ontology of a single reality exists out there. So there's like truth out there. And as researchers, our job is to go out there and uncover the truth. So it's interesting because we use a lot of post-positivist metaphors when we talk about research, right? Because like we're searching somewhere out there to try to uncover or discover truth that for some reason has been like hidden, right? After like generations of I guess, I don't know, something's been covering it, right? And so we're out here like dogs, but we're like very, very smart dogs with very sophisticated tools looking for truth. And so when it comes to like epistemology and what we know, well, we can approximate it, right? Since it's out there, we can try to see it and reach it. And by following the research process and doing like big statistics, we can kind of see some of this reality that's out there. When it comes to the values, the researchers' biases should be minimized, right? And they should be controlled and kind of kept out of the study. And so what this kind of leads to is methodologies where the objective is to uncover this knowledge, and then we do these these deductive methods where you kind of test hypothesis. If the hypothesis failed, then this must be truth, right? And this, and so you kind of build off of you build the methodology off of these beliefs when it comes to ontology, epistemology, and all. This tends to be the dominant paradigm, the dominant framework within PER, since we come from physics as a tradition. And in physics, we tend to do very objective studies of this objective nature that's out there. Now, the reason why it's post-positivism is because it's no longer deterministic, it's more like probabilistic. So it's kind of like that shift of going from classical to quantum. And in shifting those perspectives, we ended up coming with a whole much more truth when it comes to physics. So that's the post aspect. But then there's also constructivism, in which multiple realities exist, and these are constructed with others. And so reality is co-constructed as well between researchers and participants. And so it's not like you can just reach reality by interviewing someone once and it's like, oh, this is what they said, this is what they really meant, and then here we can see what's happening. It's like that's like a more post-positivist approach. Here we want to like take these interviews and have more inductive methods, right, and observations, and kind of talk with people as to what the reality is that they've experienced. And when it comes to the values, we value the values of individuals, and those are negotiated between the researchers and the participants. Now, I hold some of these when it comes to like the constructing realities with others, but I do also have some personal philosophies that involve aspects related to like pragmatism. So for pragmatism, reality is what is useful or what is practical. The epistemology is that reality is achieved with evidence that is practical, right? If we have if the evidence is available, then that's the evidence that we use. And when it comes to the values, there's this recognition that knowledge is biased by the researchers and participants. So we have to kind of talk about it because it's what's happening. And when it comes to the research that is employed, we end up using methods that are either qualitative, quantitative, whatever is going to get to that truth, right? So when I was doing my poetic analysis, right? So like I was doing a metaphor analysis, these people were telling me what success was, and somebody mentioned that success in physics is the exhilaration of jumping out of an airplane, because things are going right and everything is going well, and like the research, and you're like finding things out. And when I explained it, I was like, success in physics is a very emotional experience when things are going well and outcomes are what you expect, right? And so she was like, well, that doesn't really capture the emotion that I intended. And I was like, yeah, you're right, right? And so if I'm trying to interpret what this person said with the scientific prose and in my interpretation, the emotional association was pretty much neglected, then the process that I was doing was not leading to complete knowledge. So in order to have a more complete knowledge, I argued that we had to employ methods that center the emotions that the participant intended. I went through a bunch of different methods, seeing what kind of inquiry and what kind of analytical approaches would center this. And I found poetic analysis, where you take somebody's transcript and you turn it into a poem, focusing on the reasons and the emotions of what was said. So boom, I used a poetic analysis, right? And so I to some extent, I follow some pragmatic approaches as well. And I do explicitly follow critical theories, right? So the reality is rooted in power and oppression, and depending on who's in power, that's what's going to be truth, right? So if your reviewers of your articles say that you're wrong, you're going to have to try really hard to argue against and like show them that you're actually right, right? Once you convince them, it's true. If it's not, it gets rejected, and then you're going to have to try again, right? So there's power over who, like there's power involved over what is real and what is not, right? And so I very much hold on to these, and there are dimensions such as race, gender, class, disabilities that influence this power. And so you want to incorporate critical feminist theories or race theories or disability theories, right? And so the things that you're looking for kind of inform those perspectives. Reality is known through this study of power structures, and I believe that the research that we do can change the reality of people, and we can use the research that we do to transform the spaces. When it comes to values, there is this value for diversities of values, but then also we want to highlight and amplify the values of people who are oppressed because they are oppressed. And so we started with those assumptions that power and oppression is influencing, and we want to challenge dominant frames, right? So with this in mind, I had to go through, and when I learned about this, I had to inspect this, like, well, what do I believe is real? What is my view of what is my ontological view? It's like, what do I believe that there's a truth out there? I mean, to some extent there is, right? Because like I'm walking and I'm like touching, and then this is definitely happening. But I can't prove that y'all exist, right? Like we've all taken philosophy. It's a hard discussion. And at the end, like I feel like this reality is filtered through my interpretation and my worldview. So there's going to be these biased approaches. And so as I go through the world, I recognize that there is some world out there, but I also see that we're building knowledge together. We're building reality together. And it kind of like amplifies, it gives me purpose that I can do this work to change these conditions that are oppressive. Depending on what kind of research you do and your philosophies, right, you might want to answer different questions or have different approaches as to what you're doing. So I kind of want to ask y'all, which interpretive frameworks or philosophical assumptions do you align with? So you don't have to answer these right now, but kind of keep it out for the discussion at the end. How am I doing on time? I can check. I'm sorry. Somebody mind typing it in for me?
It's still like you still have like 20 minutes. So
okay, cool. Yeah, we're almost there. Okay, so theoretical frameworks. We kind of talked about theories. Now the theoretical framework again is this like well, I'll read the quote. Right? A theoretical framework comprises the theories expressed by experts in the field into which you plan to research, which you draw upon to provide a theoretical coat hanger for your data analysis interpretation results. Right. So this has to do. This kind of starts relating the topics that you want to cover. Right. So when we talk about conceptual understanding or reasoning, talk about scientific practices, people's beliefs, attitudes, their epistemologies, the experiences, right? Because I focus on the experiences currently, experiences with discrimination of people of color or graduate students of color, but then also looking into the mentorship, right? And there's entire structures, entire theories for mentorship, right? Entire theories for conceptual understanding, reasoning, and so depending on what you're interested in, right, depending on what topic you're looking at. So when I was looking at success in physics, right, the topic of success was related to motivational theories. And so I looked into expectancy value theory. I ended up, there's like goal orientation theories. You know about Carol Dweck's mindset theory. She's like fixed mindset, growth mindsets. These are all very complex theories relating specific topics, right? And so as you get specialized in a topic, you start learning from these, and these start informing the different concepts, constructs, definitions, objects that you're going to be looking for as you go doing your research, right? So it's worth noting, considering if these theories are in line with your interpretive frameworks and those philosophies, right? Because if you're doing some kind of psychological theory, right, where I can determine how somebody is feeling based off how their word is like shaking, that can be like a way of doing it. Or I can ask the person, is like, hey, how are you feeling, right? And so in asking them how are they feeling, they can tell me, and then we could take a more constructivist approach, right? But in that case, I would have to take more a different approach than this psychological perspective of the linguistics, right, and conversation dynamics. Um, so depending on your philosophies and what you value, you're gonna try to prioritize, or some of these theories kind of vibe with you. Some people will tell you that a theory will speak to you, or you just kind of resonate with the theory. I don't know how you want to put it. Y'all can vibe however you want to vibe to it. But sometimes they just click, right? And either somebody kind of just like mentions it, or you were like reading a book and like, oh, this kind of made sense. I ended up having a book with like 6 different motivational theories, and I picked one called motivational systems theory because it had 24 different goals, different kinds of goals. And if like somebody were to engage like a multitude of these goals, then they're more likely to engage in something. And so what I wanted to say was that people have a lot of different goals. And if we were to include and be like highlight the different goals that women have, then we can support this variety, this diversity of goals. And so motivational systems theory kind of fell in line with that purpose, right? Because I felt that certain goals were prioritized, and they were prioritized by the people in power, who tend to be white men, right? So there's a series of goals that are not prioritized or amplified or valued. So I wanted to bring in all this diversity of goals. This theory, motivational systems theory, had a huge set of them and was in line. So boom, chose it, right? And so that's kind of how I ended it. But the question goes, how did you end up with the theories guiding your work, right? Did you vibe to them? Did somebody just kind of give them to you, or like, is that what people have been doing, so you're doing it? I don't know. It's kind of just worth thinking about that, right? And then these research questions kind of end up following, right? Because once you get a knowledge of what's going on, you start seeing some gaps in the literature, maybe something that you notice could be explored. And we're going to end up asking some research questions. And I understand that research questions are just one way of guiding a study, because sometimes you have like purpose statements. Sometimes you have like gaps in literature that guide research studies. There's different ways of setting off a study, but I want to focus specifically on research questions because of this framing. So now this was, I read this from this paper, Critical Theoretical Frameworks in Engineering Education. And so they came about and they looked at a whole bunch of different research projects and saw that they fell within these frames of deficit-oriented questions, anti-deficit, and critical theory guided questions. And they specifically look for theory, critical theory questions, because that's the lens that they were bringing into the study. But it's interesting, right? Because this, I never actually considered that questions can be addressed in this way, right? And again, they're addressed in specific ways depending on what values and what your interpretive frameworks are, right? So a deficit oriented question can be like, to what extent do Black engineering students participate in engineering extracurriculars? Or why do Latinx students leave the engineering pipeline, right? Why are Native American students underprepared for engineering courses, right? And you can go out and look for why they're underprepared, why they're leaving, right? And there's kind of like, you're looking into what's going on with these deficits. So from the jump, you already framing people as having these deficits, right? Then there is use to these types of studies, but then there's different use with regards to anti-deficit framing, right? When we want to ask like, what's, instead of like these deficit, right? We want to ask like, what stimulates Black engineering students to participate in engineering? Or what compels Latinx students to persist despite the institutional challenges? Or like, if they do have these challenges, how do they overcome the disadvantages, right? So instead of looking at the deficits, we're looking more as like, how are they overcoming these barriers, right? Now, I've seen this as like a deficit and anti-deficit with regards to personal individual, like to the individuals, but then you can also shift the critique towards the systems and the institutions. And that's where the critical perspective comes in, right? Because of the power and how institutions are involved. And so instead of just focusing on the overcoming of the individual or why they're not overcoming, how do engineering extracurricular activities promote engineering, right? Participation. What institutional challenges, right? So like, what is the institutional, how is the institution involved, and what is preventing Latinx students to persist? How are institutions responsive to varied levels of educational preparation for Native American students, right? So now you're starting to ask questions with regards to the institutions, right? So keep in mind that depending on the question that you ask, different methods might be more useful, right? So if I'm going to be looking into like what institutional challenges are preventing students, then it wouldn't really make sense to look into like an item like analysis, right, of like of test scores, right? If I want to know like how are institutions responsive, then maybe looking at policy, right, or at events, right? Maybe doing more corpus approaches as to like what has happened. Maybe asking, and so you can start thinking about like who's going to be where are going to be the relevant sources of information to answer your questions. And so it's important just considering what frame are you giving to your, or how are you framing your questions, right? And so which frame do your research questions more align with, right? Or is your research questions consistent with your philosophies, right? And your theories as well. With methodological frameworks, we start getting more into the methods, right? Now, methodology, people will tell you and they'll fight you that methodology is very different from methods. And it is, right? So the ology part has to do with the knowledge, right? The knowledge behind the methods. So the reasons, right? So in here, we can talk about the methodology is concerned with descriptions, explanation, justification, and evaluation of the process of scientific inquiry, right? So it's not just about this is what I'm doing, it's why I'm doing it, right? It's like, it's not just that I'm going to interview people. I'm interviewing people because we're doing like in this case, you start talking about the genres and the different approaches, the methodological approaches. And so in qualitative research, there's phenomenologies, there's ethnographies, case studies, narrative inquiry, grounded theory. These you can find in that Cresswell book. But then there's also arts-based methods that are up and coming and becoming more prevalent. I'm trying to bring some of those in here with like poetic analysis. Eventually, I feel like we can do some music and like, I think Simone Hayter Adams and Tamia Williams were trying to do some theater and performance analysis, right, and inquiry. And so there are arts-based methodologies that are up and coming, and there's reasons why it's useful to incorporate arts, right, and to do poetic analysis and such. And for that reason, you want to describe, right, and you want to choose the methodology that is in line with your interpretive frameworks, right? And it's going to answer questions relative to the theories that you're informed with. And it's they're going to answer the questions that you set out. Now, some theories might prioritize some methodologies, right? And your work is cut out, right? And so one of the things that happens in quantitative research is that we tend to, since we've been post-positivist for so long, we've kind of no longer had to examine that. And we just kind of go along doing the quantitative assessments and this like big data analysis. But we can try different methodologies, right? I believe in this case is where we start getting into like there's social network analysis, right? There's like, you could start doing like survey analysis of like classroom interactions. And so you can, there's definitely different like genres of quantitative work. I'm totally going to fail y'all there because I'm not familiar. It became very clear as I was working on the presentation. But this is kind of like where your theories and how you, like for me, I was at one point doing the quantitative work, but then I started looking into like the assessment that I was looking at, the grade that people were given was in comparison to some experts, and they never told us who the experts were. And based on the demographics of PER and what's historically been around, they're probably white men. So how are we going to be grading people's attitudes compared to these white men who we aren't really sure who they are, right? So I was like, man, like this data is like busted. Like, so I had to like reshift, and I was like, you know what, this like multiple choice stuff isn't going to work for me. I need to get into people's in like stories. I need to get like explanations. I want to see how they're thinking and like what are the different structures in their mind. And so I moved away from the quantitative approaches into these more qualitative, like phenomenological approaches and arts-based approaches. And again, like this kind of starts going into the different interviews that you do or focus groups, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to do now is use focus groups to connect people who are minoritized, right? Is as researchers, we're able to connect people across, like if I'm like reaching out and I know people who are Hispanic, right? Because that's my population, and I know them across the country. But I know that when I was in school, I didn't know other Mexican like physics education researchers, right? So if my studies in that, and I'm have all these people accessible to me, if people of color find value in counter spaces, then it makes sense to connect them with focus groups, right? Of course, like it's for the sake of data and data collection, but there's power in research methods, right? We can change the reality with the research that we do. And so I want to employ that, right? When it comes to like the people that I work with, you can pay people, right? You can pay people a good amount of money for that work. You can, yeah, it's pretty much, there's a whole different ways of lining up the data collection with your frameworks, right? So at one point with the critical race Nepantela methodologies, I'm committed to being a bridge to the participants. So the participants are telling me that they're interested in grad school, and I know that there's a bunch of grad school waivers, and then I know that there's these opportunities for in like different, the things that they're interested in, then it would make sense for me to connect them. And so I made sure that at the end of my interview, I provided resources to the participants that were relevant to what they said. And I knew what resources were relevant because of my expertise and the way that I'm involved in the community, right? And so I'm bringing my entire self as part of the approach, right? And so there's power to the methods. Depending on how you're philosophically inclined, you can do as you wish, right? Not as you wish, as is allowed, you know, as acceptable. But there's a lot of potential out there. When it comes to the analytical frameworks, I think about these frameworks that kind of structure the analysis, right? So what is the analysis that's happening? There's a lot of different types of analysis. So in qualitative analysis, we get thematic analysis. So you review like a bunch of different interviews, and there's kind of like themes that come up. So boom, you can do content analysis where you count the number of things, and then you present, it's like, oh, these people mentioned this 20 times. This mentioned it 10 times, right? There's analytic induction where you contrast stories and end up generating knowledge based off of that induction, right? There's the metaphor analysis where I was looking into the metaphors that people used, since metaphors can give us an idea of how people think. Poetic analysis, right? There's interpretative phenomenological analysis, which goes very into detail of like having discussions about all the different things that led to an interpretation. Once you start getting to data, so like when I was working with the participants, I went back to them and I'm like, hey, what categories do you see? Like what similarities do you see between these metaphors? And I got a whole list of metaphors that were related. And I ended up getting like 60 different metaphor groups. And there was like metaphors that were grouped together more often than not. And at the end, I had this data set that lent itself very beautifully to cluster analysis. And I did some cluster analysis. And what I thematically saw and what the participants were telling me is what was kind of revealed in the cluster analysis, which was really cool. But I was not familiar with cluster analysis, and I'm not quantitatively inclined, so I didn't touch it because that's not the methodology that I was going for, right? but it was possible. And I saw it. One of the people in my committee was like, hey, did you think about this? And I did. But that's not the methodology that I'm following, right? That's not the it's not in line with the analytical framework, because yeah, the clusters could kind of emerge, but then I'm just like, it's like taking away the person out of it, right? And it's more like, no, like these people told me why they're related. I don't need a computer, like an algorithm, right, to tell me that these things are related. And then there's all these other analytical frameworks that we can employ. Now, when it comes to achieving trustworthiness, these are final thoughts. We have our different paradigms, right, or different interpretative frameworks. And certain people value certain types of evidence and certain types of knowledge more than others. With my pragmatic approach, I've recognized that if I want to publish something and if I want my work to be accepted by the community, I have to address the different knowledges that people prioritize, right? So when we go through and validate the work that we've validate our results, our outcomes from the analysis, there's different ways of doing that, right? And for quantitative researchers, there's often some kind of statistical test, some statistical measure that can give you how good something is. And to some extent, I see those as like triangulating the data with itself, right? But then there's also when it comes to qualitative work, you can you can get data, you find some kind of theme, right? And within that data, and then you compare it to another data set. And then if you say it in that data set, then it makes sense. And then there's like, oh, okay, then what we thematically saw was triangulated, right? But then you can also check with participants and be like, hey, participants, this is what I found. Does this make sense to you? If it checks out with them, we're good. You can also leave an audit trail, right, in which you're outlining every single decision that you make and why you're making it. And if somebody wants to know, it's like, oh, well, what is the reason that you did that? Or this doesn't seem logical. You can pull up that audit trail and be like, look, this is the exact reason why I did this. And you can follow that, right? And so people external to the study, and sometimes you can actually hire an auditor, like somebody as external that's going to review your work to make sure that it's consistent. And then you can write it into your paper, oh, this was reviewed by a third person party, and it's consistent. And then boom, you get that. But then there's also constructivist paradigms, right, where you can, sometimes you'll get, yeah, there might be triangulation, right? But sometimes there's evidence that kind of doesn't back it up. And so you have to go through and explain that even in light of this disconfirming evidence, you're still recognizing this theme because of something, right? So you present the evidence that kind of goes against what you're claiming, but then you, at the end of the day, you're still stating the reasons why, and hopefully that can be a consistent way of getting that validity, right? Increasing trustworthiness that what you're doing is valid. If you want the participants to see that, if you want the work to be trustworthy with regards to the participants as well, through this constructivist approach, you have to be prolonged in the field, right? And the more you engage with the people, the more you're familiar with the literature, hopefully your interpretations are well informed. And so when I worked with the participant in my work, I made sure that I was constantly in the literature, but I always made sure that I was always talking to women around me about my interpretations, right? Because as a man, I don't think that I have the final say. And to some extent I did, right? Because I published my dissertation, but I always had that validity from other people, and as well as being engaged with my participants, right? And so when it comes to this critical paradigm, right, I engaged a lot on this collaboration with the participants, hoping that collaboration led to some trustworthy results. And when it came to the peer debriefing, going to like an external expert, the expert that I reached out to was Idakis Rodriguez, who was a Latina, doing qualitative research, right? So that was somebody that had knowledge of the experiences, who was familiar with the qualitative work, and was able to talk with me in a very honest way. So with that in mind, I touched on maybe like 2 or 4, like maybe like 5 of these different ways of addressing my trustworthiness, in hopes that if somebody that's like a positivist is like, oh, well, how do you know this is real? It's like, oh, well, I checked with the participants and I checked, like, you can check my audit trail if you really want to see it, right? Or if somebody is like, oh, but like, are you sure that what you're saying is like representative what the person said, like what they intended? Is like, yeah, like I literally worked with them like for 4 different, like for 4 or 5 hours at a time, right? And so always trying to achieve that trustworthiness. So again, this is more like the pragmatic aspect of me, right? Where I'm trying to get this to be published and be accepted. But if you're very aligned with a certain critical paradigm and you want to take on all of them on like a research reflectivity, collaboration, and peer debriefing, do your thing, right? So that's kind of on you to figure out where you stand, and where you're, and again, like who your audience is will be, who your audience is. So with that said, that's it. This is my talk. Thank you very much.